Hello and welcome. I am Lukesh Maharaj, the facilitator of this webinar on critical perspectives on vaccine hesitancy. On behalf of the College of Humanities and the DVC Professor Mkize, I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you and thank you for taking time to join us today. In the presentations today, you will hear about, among other things, how COVID-19 has affected specific communities in their locations, the alliance between religion and politics in the context of COVID-19, how religious leaders behave during COVID-19 and the impact that this might have to fight the scourge of COVID-19, as well as attitudes of scholars, scientists, doctors, and lay public on vaccination. Now we have a Q&A box and a chat box for you to paste or place your questions so that we can ensure that we are helping you as best as possible with critical perspectives on vaccine hesitancy. So please feel free to drop your questions on the topic, but also to share your struggles and your experiences. And at the end of the presentations, we will try to answer your questions. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the pros who will talk about critical perspectives on vaccine hesitancy. And I also want to just remind you that the webinar is being recorded and it is also being live streamed on YouTube. So the presenters today, we have Professor Suleiman Dango, who is a Professor Emeritus of the University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. He has authored several book chapters and journal articles, translated Arabic manuscripts, and edited several books. His recent publications include the Muslim Students Association of South Africa and an edited volume on Muslim personal law in South Africa. Our second presenter is Dr. Meshri Chinsami, who is the research manager of the DST NRF Center in Indigenous Knowledge Systems with its hub at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. She has extensive knowledge and experience in research and innovation processes in thematic areas of biological, conservation and environmental sciences, traditional medicine, food security, bioethics, and she is involved in curriculum development, strategic project planning and implementation, knowledge brokerage, service rendering, and internationalization through collaboration with diverse networks. We also have with us today, all the way from Canada, Professor Pratap Kumar Penumala, who is a Professor Emeritus at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. He is the author of several books and scholarly papers and has edited several books. His recent publications include Hinduism and the Diaspora, a South African narrative. His edited volumes include Classical and Contemporary Issues in Indian Philosophy and Religion and Contemporary Hinduism. And our fourth speaker today is the Reverend Sipiwe Ndebele, who is the senior pastor of the Good Shepherd Baptist Church in Potchefstroom. He is also the current National Executive President of the Baptist Convention of South Africa. He has served in different capacities in the national structures of the Baptist Convention of South Africa for over 3 decades. He also serves in other ecumenical groups as well as the national leader, of his denomination, which is the Baptist Convention of South Africa. So without further ado, I'd like to call upon our first speaker today, Dr. Chinsami, to do her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson, for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. Please just confirm, Chair, if you can see the presentation.
Yes, we can see it. Thank you.
All right. Firstly, I was going to say good afternoon, but now that I see Prof. Pratap from the other side of the globe, I'm going to have to say good day, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Special acknowledgement to my panel members here today, and our appreciation to the webinar organizers for inviting the Department of Science and Innovation, National Research Foundation, Center of Excellence in Indigenous Knowledge Systems, based here at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Just to give you a small background about the center quickly, it's just that we are a consortium of 5 higher education institutions here in the country, that including our universities of Limpopo, Venda, Northwest University, and University of South Africa. And we've just recently joined the College of Humanities as being the hub of the African Institute in Indigenous Knowledge Systems. And today it's a joint presentation between Prof. Kaya, which is the director of the center, and myself. And we are presenting on Indigenous knowledge conceptualizations on vaccine hesitancy as part of this webinar on critical perspectives on the phenomenon. And we're hoping that through some of the arguments that we're presenting here today, as well as some of the recommendations, we are going to build towards a holistic understanding on this global and complex challenge. Just in terms of structure of presentation and given the time constraints, we have a very brief introduction, and then an Indigenous knowledge systems based perspective on the diversity and complexity of vaccine hesitancy, and then some recommendations. So ladies and gentlemen, ideally here as panelists, we are gathering mainly because perhaps local governments and our regional international health organizations are experiencing lower than anticipated vaccine coverage rates. And from an Indigenous knowledge systems perspective, perhaps we need to give an understanding of what that is from our concept. Indigenous knowledge systems are community-based knowledge that are culturally and ecologically specific. So in that context, the presentation today is using a diversity of sources from a range of countries and cultures, looking at the issue of vaccine hesitancy. And we are putting a focus on their Indigenous and other marginalized communities' perspectives on this challenge. And we're looking at their arguments regarding how we should look at diversity of conceptualizations. So from an IKS-based perspective, vaccine hesitancy should not only be a complex phenomenon, but also a context-specific phenomenon, which should vary across our population groups in terms of our cultures, our spiritual beliefs, our time, space, our ways of knowing, and the type of vaccine that is being considered at the time. Just as there are diverse conceptualizations of vaccine hesitancy, there are also a multiplicity of factors that influence this phenomenon, such as convenience, and from a community perspective, that would refer to access, confidence, that would maybe refer to the appropriateness and relevant knowledge and awareness amongst our local communities, and trust, which refers to the reliability and our past experiences as local communities and marginalized spaces as well. Hence, our presentation's focus today is on Indigenous communities and other marginalized communities' perspectives. For some, vaccine hesitancy is perhaps a set of beliefs, attitudes, behaviors shared by individuals or population groups who may either outright decline a vaccine, delay their uptake, or accept it despite their doubts. Others may look at vaccine hesitancy as a delay or refusal for the vaccine despite its availability. So some might understand vaccine hesitancy being currently characterized as an emerging term in the social medical discourse, but it's not something new or unique to COVID-19. For example, we found that the WHO is referring to vaccine hesitancy as some of the major threats to global health, where communities and social groups are delaying vaccine schedule or sourcing alternative vaccine schedules. In a 2-year study that was done by the WHO and the UNICEF, it was found that over 90% of the member states were reporting on vaccine hesitancy. What was unique, or what was interesting in this report, was that this was not only in certain regions of the world, like developing regions where people tend to think it might be a challenge. It was across WHO regions. It was across country level incomes. So we find that there's a growing questioning, a sense of mistrust and resistance on a global scale in terms of vaccines. And South Africa is no exception to this challenge. So ladies and gentlemen, what ideally we are liking to portray or indicate as part of the main arguments is that as much as vaccine hesitancy is a global and complex challenge, the hegemonic dominance of our Western knowledge systems and medical practices has led to a very one-dimensional conceptualization and methodological approach to vaccine and vaccine hesitancy. And this neglect of our rich diversity of worldviews, our ways of knowing, our belief and value systems, and methodological frameworks from this discourse, especially those, the context and the perspective of our indigenous knowledge and our communities, is leaving us open to a very one-dimensional understanding and not allowing us to have a holistic understanding of vaccine hesitancy as more of a continuum, a spectrum of imperatives, as opposed to just being either yes or a no to vaccines. In addition, some of the contributing vaccine hesitancy factors, those of convenience, confidence, and trust that I alluded to earlier, among our indigenous and marginalized communities, tend to neglect the contextualization in terms of our historical socioeconomic inequalities and overall neglect by our government policy frameworks. So for instance, if a community has experienced or has had a negative historical experience in terms of forced or coerced sterilization, we've had breaches of trust in the medical sphere. When you present a new vaccine, it isn't uncommon to have vaccine hesitancy, not necessarily from a cultural perspective, but from a historical experience. Moreover, if I follow on from the dominance of a Western empiricist approach, and for those of us who are trying to collect ourselves under this umbrella, a Western empiricist approach looks at something from a very generalist perspective. We believe that there's only one science, and we must be morally neutral. We should not bring the subjective issue of spirituality into science. So this dominant Western empiricist approach to public healthcare is undermining what is an IKS-based knowledge system, which is holistic. The characteristic or the nature of indigenous knowledge is holistic, community-based, biocultural, and spiritual. And this is how our communities have been mitigating and preventing the major challenges that they may experience in terms of pandemics and other disasters. In terms of number 7, we are arguing that available medical communication and information on vaccines tend to be shared in digital spaces and formats that are mostly in foreign languages, further marginalizing and alienating our communities and social groups who have little or no access, as well as no cultural association to the content being generated on pandemics. And lastly, most governments, especially in developing countries, have not managed to adequately invest in strategic relationships and partnerships with our community leaders, our community opinion makers, like our spiritual organizations who are joining me here today, to effectively communicate and disseminate critical information on pandemics like COVID-19 and the vaccines and preventative and treatment measures. So the focus has tended to be more, governments have tended to be in partnership more with pharmaceutical companies with whom our local communities have little or no relationship or connection to in any regard. So I think the recommendations that we are putting forth here are more so for discussion and encourage further and ongoing engagements and networks, I think, with ourselves as the audience here as well. One of them is to identify through perhaps mapping the diversity of vaccine hesitancy conceptualizations and some of the contributing factors from and looking at it from a geographical, historical, cultural, linguistic, and spiritual concept. We're also looking to perhaps invest in strategic relationships and partnerships with diversity of stakeholders, especially our community leadership structures, that being from the spiritual background, our traditional leadership backgrounds, gender, youth, and other marginalized social groups. We should also look to diversify our future public healthcare messaging in terms of communication and information formats, in terms of ensuring that the content is culturally, spiritually, and linguistically appropriate and relevant to our local communities. And then to promote intergenerational and cross-cultural dialogues on the prospects and challenges that we face in terms of community-based preventative pandemic mitigation strategies. Chairperson, I think this is where I can come to an end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Chinsami, for that very informative presentation. And we look forward to discussion around this a little later in the program. We're now going to move on to our second presentation. And this presentation is going to be, Professor Dango, are you ready?
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't know how the sound is. Can you tell? Is the sound okay?
We can hear you clearly. So we're now going to have a presentation by Professor Suleiman Dango. Over to you, Professor Dango. Thank you.
Okay, I've given the title South African Muslim Attitudes to Vaccination. Of course, we're talking about a coronavirus vaccination. Now, by way of introduction, I can say that people who are involved in actual debate on vaccination in the Muslim community are obviously the scientists, the doctors, and the religious scholars. They call ulama, in Arabic. And among all of these sectors, there are both supporters.
Sorry, Professor Dango, are you sharing a screen with us? Or?
No,
okay,
no, I'm not sharing the screen.
Okay, can you put your video on, please, if you don't mind? Thank you.
Because I'm actually looking at my PowerPoint. So I put my video on.
That's fine. That's fine. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. So among them, there are pro and anti-vaxxers among all these three groups. And this is not only true of South Africa, but I think globally, in all Muslim countries. Now, as far as the global situation is concerned, most Muslim countries, not all of them, demand a vaccine certificate before people are allowed into the country. And if we look at Saudi Arabia, which is the site for the pilgrimage every year, for the last 2 years, of course, they did not have pilgrimage. But even now, anybody who goes to Saudi Arabia has to be vaccinated, so will not admit anyone. So globally, picture is that the vast majority of Muslims throughout the world, they support vaccination. Now, let's looking at the Muslim doctors. We have an organization here in South Africa called Islamic Medical Association of South Africa. And I believe they represent the majority of Muslim doctors who are concerned about ethical issues and legal issues from an Islamic perspective. And this organization has been promoting vaccination on a very, very large scale through interviews on radio and so on. There, of course, there is a small minority of Muslim doctors who are opposed to vaccination, but primarily this is for medical reasons, scientific reasons. They're not very sure whether vaccines will work or whether they have any harmful effects and so on. But a few of them are also influenced by theologians, and we'll come to that later on. As far as the scientists are concerned, globally, Muslim scientists are in favor of vaccinations. A number of Muslim countries have already produced their own vaccines. We look at Iran, Malaysia, Turkey, Pakistan, there may be others as well. So globally, there is no hesitancy towards vaccination. of course, except minorities, I think, in all these countries. If you look at South Africa itself, the scientists who are leading research into vaccination are, of course, Professor Salim Abdul Karim, who was the leader of the South African Ministerial Advisory Committee on COVID-19, and Professor Shabir Mahdi, who led the first two COVID-19 vaccine studies in Africa. So from a professional point of view, obviously, we don't have a problem with scientists, Muslim scientists being the forefront of research into vaccination. Now, as far as the theologians are concerned, what you need to understand, just as a background, is there is no central religious authority in Islam, unlike the Pope among the Catholics. So Saudi Arabia actually, while it's a place of pilgrimage, the religious authority in South Africa have no jurisdiction over other countries. So I think that's something of a misconception. You know, people believe if any ruling comes from Saudi Arabia, all the Muslims are expected to adopt it. No, not at all. So there is no central authority. So this explains why there is such a divergence of views among Muslim scholars, not only on vaccination, on almost all contemporary issues. So not only between countries, divergence, but also within countries. In South Africa, South Africa itself, we have a number of bodies, and so they do not agree on many issues. Now, even in Muslim countries where they have a Ministry of Religious Affairs, which is supposed to be, issuing edicts or rulings and so on, and all the whole population is supposed to abide by them. It does not happen. In the case of coronavirus, if we look at Pakistan itself, the government took a decision about social distancing, masking, and so on. But there were religious scholars who defied the government. They didn't go along with the ruling and so on. So this is a situation, of course, globally. South Africa is no exception to it. Now, if we look at the theologians, what is the attitude towards them? Now, they are divided, as I said earlier. They're divided not only in South Africa, but globally. But both the supporters of vaccines and the opponents of vaccines, both of them will cite primary texts, Islamic texts, or they will cite opinion of Muslim scholars. So both of them do that, and that's what makes it so difficult for the ordinary person. What does it follow? Because both of them justify the positions. Now, the overwhelming majority of scholars in South Africa are in support of vaccination, and the evidence is that the United Ulama Council of South Africa has 9 affiliates. It is the largest theological group and represents the views of the majority of Muslims in this country. There are others, but they are smaller. And since UKSA supports it, we can safely assume that majority of the theologians in South Africa support vaccination. Of course, this also applies globally. Every country you see now, you'll find the Muslim scholars come out very, very strongly in support of vaccination. Now, these theologians in South Africa itself, they have been up in the forefront of promoting it. They also issue newsletters. They have interviews on radio, on television. They give lectures in mosques and so on and so on. But of course, there is a minority which is opposed to vaccination for a number of reasons, which I will just detail just now. And there is no love lost between the two factions. Of course, that's a different issue altogether. Now, why is there theological support for vaccinations? One is based on principle, because there are 5 or 6 major primary objectives of Sharia, that is Islamic law. The primary one, the first one, is preservation of life. So the theologians will argue that you have to do everything in your power to preserve life, to preserve health. So if the vaccinations are proven to be either, obviously preventing serious illnesses and so on, then it becomes an obligation. It's compulsory to actually take the vaccination. And not to do so would actually constitute a sin. Then, of course, we have precedents in history. There is, of course, there are two primary sources in Islam. One is the Quran itself, which Muslims believe to be a revelation. Then we have the prophetic tradition where the Prophet Muhammad sayings have been collected, and they are followed by Muslims. As a second source, the primary source, yes. One of his sayings that if you hear of an outbreak of plague in a land, do not enter it. But if the plague breaks out in a place while you are in it, do not leave that place. Now, this is very clear that if there is plague, you don't enter it so you don't become infected. And if you are in it, don't get out because then you will infect others. So this is cited by the people who support vaccination. And then, of course, a very important historical event that occurred during the time of the second Caliph Umar, that was in 638, when he was on the way to Palestine, and he heard that in a certain village, there was a pandemic which had broken out. It was spreading to Syria, Iraq, and so on, and Iran, and thousands of people were killed. What he did is he sought the opinion, he consulted the so-called elders in his group, who advised him that they should not continue the journey and they must turn back. So they turned back. So again, this is historical evidence that you should protect yourself. Take whatever measures are needed to protect yourself from being infected. Now, what's the attitude of the general Muslim public? The general public is influenced, of course, by doctors, scientists, and theologians, referring, of course, to issues of health, including vaccination. And since a majority of the doctors, as I said earlier, belonging to the Islamic Medical Association, they are in favor of vaccines. And of course, the scientists as well. We see them regularly on television here. Since they've been promoting vaccinations, the general public, we can expect, is very well disposed to vaccinations. But there is a sizable minority which is either opposed to vaccines or hesitant. And hesitancy, of course, comes from three different, based on three different factors, and I'm going to just outline them very quickly. The one is science. And of course, this is not peculiar to the Muslims. This is a general position, the people who are not sure whether the vaccines are safe enough. And of course, because and they also argue that there were not sufficient trials that have been conducted to, convince people that the vaccines actually work. So they are both. This is based on science, and as I said, this is not peculiar to Muslims. There are lots of people of other faiths who are also, even some doctors, of course, who are reluctant to take vaccines. Then it is the conspiracy theories. This is very big. Some Muslims are very big on conspiracy theories. And again, it's not, I think, confined to Muslims, but it's, I'm just listen to all the stories that are going around. I actually did an article on this, just published in the Muslim Views. The one, of course, assumption is that there is a plan to reduce the world's population through the vaccines. It's very interesting, and people who are arguing this right at the beginning, and of course, someone was saying they want to reduce the Black population. And I pointed out to them, I said, excuse me, the Black population in Africa don't even have the vaccines. They actually, it's circulating in the white population in Europe and so on. And of course, then they said, oh yeah, so this kind of conspiracy theories. One is, again, it's a big pharmaceutical companies who are promoting vaccines, and of course that's true. But what these people believe is that there is no need for the vaccines. In other words, there could be other ways to treat the disease, but because the vaccines are going to bring in large profits, that is why they're deliberately promoting the vaccines. Then, of course, the story about Bill Gates. They say he's the mastermind behind this promotion, obviously to enrich himself. And when it comes to scientists, because we have these arguments, we say, what about the scientists? And they said, well, the scientists have to, agree with the pharmaceuticals because they receive funding from the pharmaceuticals. Now that's true as well, because Prof. Stom Karim and so on, for the AIDS research, they got the money from the funding from the pharmaceuticals. Now that's how it works. That's normal. But there's no suspicion is because of that relationship. These people are deliberately, intentionally promoting vaccination, or rather, they are concealing the truth from the public, right? So there's another accusation, is that the doctors and the scientists know the truth, that is vaccines are harmful or they don't work, but they're concealing this from the public. These are all conspiracy theorists. And of course, some of them even say the governments, this is the biggest one, they support the agenda of the internationalists, the Illuminati. There's a group of people who are supposed conspiring to take over the world. And one of the ways they're going to do it is through the population control, through the vaccination. Then we come to the theologians. Now, those theologians who are opposed to vaccination, they either refuse, they refuse to be vaccinated, and they also advise the followers not to be vaccinated. They give talks in the mosque and so on. Although it's a minority, but it's pretty vocal. And some of the reasons, first of all, they will say, you will die at your appointed time. So it doesn't matter whether you take the vaccine or not, it's not going to make any difference. So I take it. Then, of course, they say the vaccines contain what in Arabic is called haram substance. Haram means impermissible. I don't know where they get that information from, because, people have actually looked at the ingredients. I mean, all over UK and so on. Even the scholars in the UK spoke to the scientists and so on, and they know that the ingredients which are contained are permissible. They're not impermissible. Again, this is how shall I say, being propounded by those people, theologians who are anti-vaccination. And of course, another one is that you should have strong faith in God. You must have strong conviction. And if you have strong conviction, nothing will happen to you. You won't be affected. You don't need the vaccination. Okay, so in conclusion, then I want to say the following. A substantial number of Muslims are influenced by theologians. There's no doubt about it. But in this particular case of the vaccination, fortunately, the majority of theologians in South Africa, they support vaccinations. And they have also publicly announced that they have been vaccinated. And that makes a very big difference, because when people see this and they said, okay, if the theologians are being vaccinated and they are supporting it, we will go for it. Another thing that has been happening is that many people, especially the young people, don't have much faith in the theologians' capacity to deal with modern developments, whether it's in the field of science or politics or economics or education or health and so on. So they don't, and of course they also exposed to internet and media and so on. So they have other sources of information. And so they're not easily swayed by those theologians who consider the vaccination to be impermissible. Now, finally, even among those who have not been vaccinated, there are two different categories of people. Some of them are in principle opposed to vaccinations for the reasons I've already cited earlier. And some are just uncertain. I mean, we meet friends and they said, well, I'm waiting. I'm not so sure. I'm going to see how things happen, and I might just take it later on. Okay, so those are the points I wanted to raise. I'm trying to just give you a balanced perspective. But as I said, in the community, as far as my observations are concerned, by and large, there's support for vaccinations. There is, of course, a minority of doctors and theologians who are anti-vaccine. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Professor Dango, for that very simple explanation, simple way in which you explained the vaccine hesitancy, especially in the Muslim community. And I think what we've seen coming through from the first two presentations is that there are divergent views, and also that the issue of vaccination is a complex one. It's not, as I think Dr. Chinsami said, it's not as simply a matter of yes or no. There are various factors that need to be taken into account when one decides on the issue of vaccination. Recently, I looked at, because Professor Dango spoke about the conspiracy theory and about maybe trying to reduce the population. The latest statistics that I have, and it may have changed recently, is that only 11% of the population in Africa have actually been vaccinated. So I'm not sure how well that conspiracy theory is working. But anyway, we're now going to move on to our next presentation, which is going to be done for us by Professor Pratap Kumar. So over to you, Professor. Thank you very much. Professor Kumar, you are muted. Can you unmute yourself, please? Thank
you. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, Prof.
Yes. What I'm going to talk about today is vaccine hesitancy and some of the Hindu attitudes and responses, not only within South Africa, but also globally. And in passing, I also would refer to the broader perspectives, insights, in general. So first of all, let me pull up some figures. I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. In terms of Africa overall, we have 9.02 million cases as of yesterday, and 172 plus deaths. But I think considering, I just want to say one point on this comparative perspective note. Considering the number of people living on the continent, the case numbers seem to be far less than what we find elsewhere. But this could be either underreported or various other factors that perhaps social scientists and mainstream scientists would have to tell us. So moving on from there, coming to the Hindu perspective, first of all, I think as Professor Dango had alluded with regard to the Muslim community, with regard to Hindu community, either in South Africa or globally, there is not substantive evidence found so far, at least in my research, to suggest that there is a negative response to vaccine mandates from the Hindu community as such. A few cases that I came across, Hindu friends of mine or people that I came to know of, who were reluctant to take vaccines. Their reasons are not so much based on religious belief, but rather because of their lack of trust in the efficacy of the vaccine itself. Again, that's another controversial point that has to be discussed. But overall, from a general religious point of view, response point of view, initially, as we all have seen everywhere around the world, there has been a lot of finger pointing and scapegoating. We started with the Chinese and then the communists and whatnot. with regard to more recently, the South Korean Church of Jesus emerged as the biggest super spreader of the virus because of their reluctancy towards the vaccination program, and also their general approach to social distancing and etc. And in the context of India, Muslims have been scapegoated by the Hindu majority as these super spreaders of the virus. So you can see the politics of the whole issue emerging, which I think is an interesting and also key aspect that has to be discussed and debated. Generally, there has been an extensive use of social media by virtually all religious groups, and many churches, for instance, have turned to online worship. With regard to Hindu community, they too have used extensively social media, internet, and emails, and so on. For example, Hindu Mahasabha of South Africa has sent in several messages throughout the process to its affiliate bodies, encouraging people to take vaccinations, follow the protocols of COVID-19, etc. But here is one important point that I want to come back to, but I just want to allude at this stage that because of the difference in religious practice as opposed to other religious communities, where Hindus generally do not tend to go to temples, organizations every day or every week or etc., as other communities do, because their tendency to associate with temples or organizations, etc., is voluntary and individual based. They go there for specific reasons when they have a particular reason to go to, and that makes it very difficult for religious authorities or leadership to reach out to their followers. So that's a point I think we can come back to. In terms of the general outreach from religious point of view, many religious communities, including churches, have reached out to their communities, offering food, medication, counseling, and so on. But with regard to, I just wanted to point out the internal differences within the Christian community. I'm sure the bishop will say more about these aspects. I just wanted to bring this comparative perspective in relation to Hindu point of view. While the mainstream churches have been actively involved in assisting their followers and so on to help them through the pandemic process, Pentecostal and charismatic churches tended to see the virus as a kind of a demonic sort of activity, or originated from the devil, and therefore they are on a spiritual war against the virus and so on, and God will take care of this, and people shouldn't use artificial, type of, stuff. So there is this kind of dichotomy within the community. But in the case of Hindu community, there is a long tradition of symbiotic relationship between religious belief and science, religious philosophies, and so on. This is perhaps one of the main reasons why Hindu response tended to be more positively disposed to towards the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, responses and so on. We know Hindu philosophies and ritual practices have long been associated with scientific ideas. For example, Hindus have for long claimed that Veda recitation, for example, has given rise to a number of disciplines, such as in humanities, phonetics, grammar, etc. And in scientific fields, the construction of the Vedic altar gave rise to geometry, and a number of scientific disciplines such as yoga, Ayurveda, that many of us are familiar with. In particular, yoga has been used throughout this pandemic period as a key resource to deal with mental aspects of this disease, anxiety levels and so on, psychological aspects. And Ayurvedic medicine has offered a number of tips in dealing with the virus and so on. So there has been a tendency to use religious-based resources within Hindu community, and both psychologically and physiologically. Another interesting aspect that has come to light during this process is the use of traditional social practices as a kind of response to the pandemic, especially when it comes to social distancing and so on. The notion of pollution or ritual pollution is an important aspect in Hinduism. This has been revived, although it had a number of negative aspects within Hindu society at large. But some of these aspects have been suddenly found to be more positively disposed towards dealing with the pandemic and so on, like greeting people with hands together, keeping a distance, and maintaining hygiene. These things were done in the context of ritual, but now they have become broadly social kind of practices, abstaining from physical contact, touching, and so on. Some of these practices have been associated historically with the discrimination against the lower caste communities. But in recent times, Hindu orthodoxy has revived these to deal with the pandemic. Although body is generally understood as kind of a polluting agent that produces polluting substances, energies, and so on. Hence, the notion of pollution has been reconfigured in this context to make them look positively disposed to dealing with COVID-19. Notwithstanding these positive factors, some of the negative factors that have come up in the context of the pandemic in recent months and in the last 2 years is the rise of Hindu nationalism when it comes to active political involvement. And Hindus have a long tradition of religious gatherings, especially during major festivals and so on. And in spite of all of these practices that require social distancing, etc., the Hindu nationalistic agenda seems to have hijacked these festival gatherings for political reasons. And this is one aspect. For example, the Kumbh Mela festival that takes place in India brings together millions of people. And so there is this political and religious Hindu kind of involvement, which kind of cautions us to be wary about some of these practices. But fortunately, within South Africa, we did not experience such aspects. But leaders of Hindu religious organizations have consistently encouraged their followers to keep social distancing and take vaccinations, etc. And organizations, for example, such as Midlands Hindu Society have in consultation with the Purohit Council of the Sri Sanatan Dharma Sabha of South Africa, Arya Samaj of South Africa, etc., have put together strict regulations to deal with the pandemic, and they have urged followers to wear masks, sanitize, and maintain social distancing, and so on. In most countries, generally, including South Africa, Hindus have confined their religious gatherings to their homes. And this is an interesting point that distinguishes Hindu community from other religious groups, in that in any case, Hindus generally perform their ritual activities in their home front, and only go to temples and religious organizations on occasions or when they have a particular reason to do so. So although many temples began to offer online worship activities and so on, like the Swaminarayan organization, and there are major temples in India too, that have, even long before the pandemic, have been used to offering online worship activities and so on. But the important point is Hindus did not have to do a great deal of adjustment in dealing with their religious practices in the context of the pandemic, because they have always been used to doing most of their religious activities on the home front. So this particular point, as I alluded to earlier on, makes the contact between religious leadership and the people on the ground a bit more complicated, because the religious leadership cannot easily have access to their followers directly to communicate to them, because they are not present in a common place like a temple or an organization all the time, as do other religious communities. So that's an interesting difference that one has to bear in mind. Coming back to the politics of Hinduism, one must also note that the long-standing symbiosis between Hinduism and science can unwittingly or sometimes deliberately result in discriminative practices against other religions, as seen in India and also in other countries such as North America. So that's one important thing that one has to be aware of in the context of Hindu response to the pandemic. And Hindus in a my last point really is to suggest that Hindus in a multicultural setting need to be conscious of their fellow citizens who practice their religions differently. Social and political discrimination can come naturally within Hindu practice, given the traditional aspects that I've mentioned earlier on, such as untouchability, pollution, philosophical and religious arrogance, and so on. Like any religious communities, Hindu community too is not immune to political power struggles. In a country such as South Africa, I believe greater awareness of the African religious practices and other religious communities is essential as a response from the Hindu community. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kumar, for that very clear explanation of the Hindu perspective on the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as on the issue of vaccine hesitancy. So I think the point that you mentioned, which was important to note, is that while sometimes, the narrative that frames opposition between science and religion, you alluded to the point that might not necessarily be the case, from a Hindu perspective. And I liked the last point that you concluded with, where you said that there needs to be greater awareness of the African religious practices, especially among Hindus and others. So I think that's a point that is well noted. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now going to proceed to our next presentation, which is going to be done by the Reverend Ndebele. So, Reverend, we hand over to you. Thank you very much. Sorry, Professor Kumar, may we ask you to please stop sharing screen? Thank you.
Okay. Oh, just.
Okay. Good day, colleagues. Am I audible enough?
Yes, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My presentation will focus on how our religious institutions, beliefs, leaders, and practice contributing to ongoing coronavirus. Thank you so much to my colleagues for the panel. In terms of their presentation, actually they covered most of the things that one has tabled here, but at least I'll continue to do my presentation as it will give more information with regard to the church in South Africa as to how it has affected us in South Africa. The religious institutions' role during the era of COVID-19 is very essential as religion forms the cornerstone of our communities. How the religious leaders behave during this period has an effect in fighting the scourge of the COVID-19. The fact that the first person to have died of COVID-19 was a minister of religion shows that the church is both infected and affected by COVID. The society looked at religious leaders and institutions for guidance and support at a time when all other social actors had shut themselves away. The emergence of COVID-19 brought an unanticipated challenge to both the church and religious institution. The church was found unprepared for such a disaster. Both the clergy and laity feared what would come out of this. Reverend John Hlangeni, who was a Baptist minister, was the first person known to have died of COVID-19. And this brought fear and trembling to the broader church and society at large, because the reality of COVID-related deaths hit home to the entire country. This also brought a spotlight on the church as a super spreader of the virus, as over 70 cases, as over 70 cases were identified from the church gathering that he had attended. And the municipalities as well in this case released a statement saying that the remains of the COVID-19 person should be considered a biohazard and called for stricter measures in the handling and the burying of COVID-related deaths. However, Prof. Shabi Mamadi did not agree with the city councils or the metro councils in the measures, and he said, and I quote, "There's no scientific basis for such a recommendation. All that needs to happen is that the same type of precautions that I exercise with any cops must be adhered to." The statement of the Mangaung Metro and many others pose fear to people to attend funerals and encourage stigmatization of families that had lost members. The stricter measures in handling of COVID-19 related deaths also caused another challenge where families and family members found themselves burying wrong people or wrong corpses, because in some instances they were not allowed to view the body before the burial. And in response to that, the religious leaders had to come closer to families and provide psychosocial support and assist families in resolving the challenge that had been caused of burying wrong corpses or people. When we look also at the religious institutions' response to COVID-19 challenge, the COVID-19 pandemic has an impact in religion in various ways, including the cancellation of worship services of various faiths and closure of pilgrimages, as already alluded by my colleagues, and other ceremonies and festivals were cancelled. Churches, mosques, and temples were closed, and they also decided to offer worship through live stream and amidst the pandemic, or held interactive sessions. The impact of COVID-19 exposed how the church, in particular in South Africa, was unequal and divided. We began to see the haves and the have-nots. Many people found themselves lacking food and other essential. Some religious leaders lost income as churches could not afford to support them, and their denominations were not financially viable to pay social relief grant. However, there were denominations and mission agencies and other religious institutions who were able to establish social relief grant to support both ministers and members in general. Religious leaders motivated members to donate food items and cash to help the poor communities. They also collaborated with the NGO sector to collect and distribute food parcels. Churches, mosques, and temples opened their doors as drop-in centers and distribution centers. Church leaders offered counseling to bereaved families and those who were going through the lockdown exhaustion and depression, guiding bereaved families on COVID protocols and making sure that families comply. Church leaders also had virtual meetings with those who could not afford who could afford to help them keep their spirituality, but they were also cognizant of the poor majority who did not have the means. They therefore had offered online counseling to anyone who was in distress. They conducted home visits to keep in touch with their members as part of the continuum of care and support. The visibility of religious leaders gave hope to the hopeless. The national church leaders, like the SACC and the Evangelical Association of South Africa, came together and created a platform to formulate strategies and develop policies and COVID guidelines to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. Throughout 2020 and 2021, the national leaders met weekly via Zoom, and this became a platform for consultation, and they successfully pulled all their resources together to respond to any query and challenge that they identified. Commissions were established, including the Health Commission, where denominations and mission agencies collaborated, finding united voice on the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. These commissions are still ongoing today, and they play a critical role. The collaboration of religious leaders who was so powerful at the time that the issue of denominationalism and fundamental doctrine and the styles of worship did not matter. Remember that within the Christian faith, you've got a number of denominations, and some of them have got their styles of worship. They differ in terms of doctrine, etc. But the coming together in this at this time did assist to bring the religious voice together. They introduced the greeting styles like your elbow greeting, the feet dance, and the virtual hug to avoid touching with hands. And they also influenced the Disaster Management Act when it came to regulation affecting the religious sector. However, this does not mean that their views and contributions were always accepted by the Central Command Council, especially on the number of people allowed to attend religious services. As difficult as it was in 2020, the religious sector or leaders agreed to hard lockdown, which meant the closure of all religious activities, including the Easter conferences. But what we with that decision on hard lockdown, it then showed that there was no unity in the churches or amongst the church leaders, because there were non-affiliated members who felt that the decision to close Easter conferences or to agree to hard lockdown was an infringement on their religious freedom. The closure of religious services during lockdown assisted in avoiding multiple infections that would have been experienced at the church gatherings. With regard to vaccination, the religious sector, the religious leaders were in support of vaccinations. Equitable access to safe and effective vaccine is critical to ending the COVID-19 pandemic. The World Health Organization worked tirelessly with partners to develop, manufacture, and deploy safe and effective vaccines. Once the vaccines were approved, the church opened its doors to serve as vaccination sites at no cost to the state. The national church leaders led by example by being among the first people to be vaccinated. Church leaders reached out to communities to encourage them to vaccinate. They reach out at pension payout centers, post office, clinics, taxi ranks, etc. The healthcare workers within the church were given slots to continuously share information with congregation. This dispelled myths and fears as it resulted with more people getting vaccinated. Religious leaders collaborated with the NGO sector, inviting them to run workshops as part of capacity program to their constituencies. The working together of religious leaders and the healthcare workers and the NGO sector on vaccinations dispelled myths and fears that members had. But we also need to accept that there was a threat on vaccination. That South African Council of Churches identified a threat on vaccination by church leaders who were against vaccination. Some pastors use their religious authority to mislead people to place their faith on God's providence rather than medical best practice was regrettable. Some suggested that God is punishing us because they view COVID as God's wrath. SACC and the Evangelical Alliance and other religious bodies continue their advocacy for all South Africans to be vaccinated as benefit both socially and economically. It was important to get about 60% to secure herd immunity. Bishop Mpumlwana said, and I quote, "When people are vaccinated, it will have far-reaching impact." The religious organizations encourage community structures and young people to go out there and identify and help the elderly in their neighborhoods to register for vaccination. They were also requested to develop database for their communities. The Methodist Church in Greenmark Square, as an example, raised a yellow flag on their steeple encouraging vaccination. Their flag read as follows: "The blood of Jesus will not save you from COVID. Get vaccinated. Protect our healthcare workers." So the belief that COVID vaccines would change the DNA of people, that it is satanic, that it contains human or animal remains, and that it is the mark of the beast according to the Christian faith, or some Christians as they believe, brought a greater challenge to the church leadership. Because of that, the organized church leaders like the SACC, the Jewish Council, the Muslim Association, and others campaigned for COVID vaccination, arguing that refusing to take vaccination is a sign of foolishness and not faithfulness. Some religious leaders promoted Holy Communion as the COVID medicine, and some have stated that Jesus is my vaccine security and immunity from COVID. Others have said, because of the blood of Jesus, COVID will pass over without touching my family. It was very difficult, therefore, to combat these false teaching on COVID vaccines without being perceived as attacking someone's religion. Thus, the religious sector had to stand up and correct the wrong doctrine publicly. This did not bring division, but united the religious institution, as the focus was not on the COVID vaccine denier, but on the people. In other words, the religious leaders decided not to focus on the person who was, or those who were denying the vaccine, but decided to focus on the people. Another curveball was thrown by the former Chief Justice Mogoeng in his published prayer, when he prayed and said the following: "If there be any COVID-19 vaccine that is the work of the devil, meant to infuse 666 in the lives of the people, meant to corrupt their DNA, may it be destroyed by fire." Close quote. In the mind of the ordinary man, this sounded as if the Chief Justice is against vaccination. The real danger of that statement was that it decreased the public trust in vaccines, especially at the time when the country was starting its rolling out program on vaccination. Because of time, I would like to conclude and say, as the coronavirus continued to cause death and disrupt people's lives globally, people turn to religious groups for direction, care, and support. Research would show that COVID bolstered the faith of most people. How we interact with society will build more confidence in the church structures or religious structures and heal the wounds of the brokenhearted. It is time for the religious sector, for the church, to take a rightful position and proclaim like Christ did. He said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised." And Nate Lekin's book, The Private Monk, as I close with his quote, he says, "When we make another man's progress our concern, giving him a listening ear and a caring heart, and opening ourselves as a conduit for God's grace, we find our own propelled to a whole new level. We are truly helped by helping, taught by teaching, encouraged by encouraging, and I would add, we are being ministered to by ministering to the needs of others." I thank you. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Reverend. Thank you for bringing to our attention the important role that religious institutions can play insofar as COVID is concerned, but also as far as the vaccination drive is concerned. So while the Reverend spoke about initially religious institutions being found unprepared for COVID, he also then alluded to the fact that once vaccines were approved, the churches, for example, came to the party and offered their premises free at no cost. And he also spoke about the collaborative efforts among the different religious organizations to encourage people to take the COVID vaccination. And of course, I think the quotation that he ended with, when he said, when we make another man's progress our concern, giving him a listening ear and caring heart and opening ourselves as a conduit for God's grace, we find our own propelled to a whole new level. We are truly helped by helping, taught by teaching, and encouraged by encouraging. I found that to be a very profound way to end the and really relevant to the context that we find ourselves in at the moment as far as the vaccination is concerned. So we do have a few minutes, about 10 minutes before we end, and there are questions that have been posted on the site. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen so that the panelists and everybody will be able to see the questions. And although I do believe that some panelists have responded, but nevertheless, let me share my screen and look at the questions that have been asked. So the first question was, I don't think vaccine hesitancy is the problem. Rather, vaccine mandates are the real issue. People must have the basic right to decide what happens with their bodies with no fear of reprisal, such as losing livelihood. I'm wondering if Dr. Chinsami, you want to perhaps just respond to this, because I see you have put in something on the chat box. Dr. Chinsami?
Sorry, Chairperson, I'm just trying to identify the question that you are referring to there.
Okay, all right. It was the first question. I'm sorry, my apologies.
Is it the one on the infodemiology?
Yes, sorry. That let me just share this again. Sorry. The question was, to what extent can we attribute vaccine hesitancy to infodemiology, and are there possibilities to address this? Yeah, so Dr. Chinsami, I think you responded to this question.
Yes, Chairperson. Ideally, we're saying that the distribution and determinants of electronic health information, which is what we are looking at in infodemiology, tends to neglect, I think, the relevance of our language and the context-specific nature of community-based knowledge systems. And hence, this is building or leading to the lack of confidence and trust, etc., in vaccines in general. So what we were basically trying to say, and then from the perspective of the presentation made, oh yes, sorry for that. By neglecting the holistic, spiritual, and place-based nature of knowledge in the electronic health space, we can alienate the communities that we're actually trying to engage. So as a way forward, possibly to have community-based approaches to develop in-depth understanding of our indigenous or our local community determinants of health and vaccine and hesitancy understandings, which might even include what our value systems are, what are our belief systems, as our other panel members have indicated so far. So I think by going in and finding on the ground what is really the conceptualization and understanding of people, as opposed to assuming it as a grouping of people.
Are there any other panelists who would like to respond, to add to what Dr. Chinsami has said before we move on to the next question? Okay, so let me put up the next question. The next question is, I don't think vaccine hesitancy is the problem. Rather, vaccine mandates are the real issue. People must have the basic right to decide what happens with their bodies with no fear of reprisals, such as losing a livelihood. And Professor Kumar, I think you had responded to this. Would you like to perhaps speak to this question?
Yes, I think the issue of vaccine hesitancy and mandates are related in the sense that they precipitate each other. But I think what must happen really is, there has to be a more structured government and broader organizational response to help ordinary people like us to understand the implications of the vaccination process and its scientific aspects and so on, and provide correct information. And also, I might add that public figures, politicians or religious leaders and so on, they must be careful when they utter their statements in public, because they can have an impact on people's choices and their perception of the virus itself and the vaccination process and all of those things.
Thank you, Professor. So I think we have time to look at one more question.
Maybe I would like to add on that question.
Yes,
on the question
sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Reverend. Go ahead, sorry.
Yes, it is true that the religious leaders need to be careful on what they are, on the things that they say in public. As I highlighted earlier on the issue of the Chief Justice, and that religion also becomes a problem, as we have seen within the Christian sector, whereby religion becomes a problem as well, because people then, because of their own beliefs. So it's not the question of the vaccination as such, but it also becomes the question of their own beliefs or the teaching of their churches. So for this reason, it is therefore important that the church leaders need to come together and make sure to guide people in terms of these critical issues, because they then use religion to stop people from getting vaccinated, like it happens within some Christian churches, whereby people would not even take blood transfusion, and they say no, it is not correct for them to take blood transfusion or vaccination in this case. So the issue of religious leaders does need to be looked into. Thank you.
Reverend. So as I said, I think we have time for one more question. And the question that I'm going to put is, in your experience and expertise, what role does systemic racism, including discrimination and mistreatment in healthcare, play in vaccine hesitancy? So the question is, in your experience and expertise, what role does systemic racism, including discrimination and mistreatment in healthcare, play in vaccine hesitancy? So I'm wondering if anybody from the panel would like to have a stab at this one.
If I may just make one comment on that one. I'm not sure if the vaccine hesitancy is directly related to race or racism, but I think we have seen throughout the world during this period, and it continues to happen, that the pandemic has certainly provoked a great deal of disquiet about other communities, which resulted in racial discrimination and so on. I mean, I have seen here in Canada how non-white communities have been, especially Chinese, South Asian communities, have been unduly criticized for having spread the virus or brought the virus, or the variants and so on. So I think there is a great deal of racism underlying this whole process. But to the extent that it has resulted in vaccine hesitancy. I'm not sure. But I think as the Reverend has indicated, I think the vaccine hesitancy has largely been confined to their religious beliefs, their individual choices, their perception of the vaccine efficacy, the scientific information, and also the spread of the false theories and so on. Even by some of the leadership in communities and globally too. If President Trump could say that this vaccine, this pandemic or this virus will just disappear, or mysteriously, etc. That kind of statement is dangerous because it discourages people and misleads people in terms of their response to the pandemic and also the vaccinations and so on.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that response. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you have all enjoyed the informative webinar that the University of KwaZulu-Natal, College of Humanities and the School of Education organized today. It is my honor and privilege now to give a vote of thanks to all those who helped make this webinar happen. We would not be here without the generosity of the College of Humanities and the School of Education. I want to thank the college and the school for allowing us to gather today. I want to thank the presenters for taking time away from their busy schedules to share their message on vaccine hesitancy. The webinar would be impossible without your participation. Our thanks to the media that has been in attendance. We also acknowledge the presence of government officials from various departments. Thank you to the academics from other universities, alumni, UKZN staff and students, and the general public. I want to thank everyone who helped in making this webinar a reality. We are trying to engage religious communities in vaccination efforts, and this is indeed a continuing theme and a challenge globally. So reports have been made that collaboration among faith healers is possible and essential in the fight against COVID-19. And I believe that events like the one we had here today will help us to achieve this. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to be here today and participating in the webinar. We are so grateful to you, and thank you very much, and we wish you everything of the best.
Thank you.
Chairperson.
From my side, I think, Lokesh, thanks to you and to Melissa and all your team. And thanks for giving me this opportunity. And thank you all for joining us in this important topic. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining in, and I hope you enjoy your evening further.